Mission 100 Day 70, Second Book of Maccabees, chapters 1 through 7. Second Book of Maccabees, chapter 1. The Jews in Jerusalem and in the land of Judea sent greetings to their kindred, the Jews in Egypt, and wished them true peace. May God do good to you and remember his covenant with his faithful servants, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Give to all of you a heart to worship him and to do his will wholeheartedly and with a willing spirit. Open your heart to his law and commandments and grant you peace. Hear your prayers and be reconciled to you and never forsake you in time of adversity. Even now we are praying for you here in the reign of Demetrius, the 169th year. We Jews wrote to you during the height of the distress that overtook us in those years after Jason and his followers revolted against the Holy Land and the kingdom, set fire to the gatehouse and shed innocent blood. But we prayed to the Lord and our prayer was heard. We offered sacrifices and fine flour. We lighted the lamps and set out the loaves of bread. We are now reminding you to celebrate the Feast of Booths in the month of Kislev, dated in the 188th year. Second letter, 164 BC. The people of Jerusalem and Judea, the Senate and Judas send greetings and good wishes to Aristobulus, teacher of King Ptolemy and member of the family of the anointed priests, and to the Jews in Egypt. Since we have been saved by God from grave dangers, we give him great thanks, as befits those who fought against the king. For it was God who drove out those who fought against the holy city. When their leader arrived in Persia with his seemingly irresistible army, they were cut to pieces in the temple of the goddess Nanea through a deceitful stratagem employed by Nanea's priests. On the pretext of marrying the goddess, Antiochus with his friends had come to the place to get its great treasures as a dowry. When the priests of Nanea's temple had displayed the treasures, and Antiochus with a few attendants had come inside the wall of the temple precincts, the priests locked the temple as soon as he entered. Then they opened a hidden trapdoor in the ceiling, and hurling stones at the leader and his companions, struck them down. They dismembered the bodies, cut off their heads, and tossed them to the people outside. Forever blessed be our God, who has thus punished the impious. Since we shall be celebrating the purification of the temple on the 25th day of the month Kislev, we thought it right to inform you that you too may celebrate the Feast of Booths and of the fire that appeared when Nehemiah, the rebuilder of the temple and the altar, offered sacrifices. For when our ancestors were being led into captivity in Persia, devout priests at the time took some of the fire from the altar and hid it secretly in the hollow of a dry cistern, making sure that the place would be unknown to anyone. Many years later, when it so pleased God, Nehemiah, commissioned by the king of Persia, sent the descendants of the priests who had hidden the fire to look for it. When they informed us that they could not find any fire, but only a thick liquid, he ordered them to scoop some out and bring it. After the material for the sacrifices had been prepared, Nehemiah ordered the priests to sprinkle the wood and what lay on it with the liquid. This was done, and when at length the sun, which had been clouded over, began to shine, a great fire blazed up, so that everyone marveled. While the sacrifice was being burned, the priests recited a prayer, and all present joined in with them. Jonathan led, and the rest responded with Nehemiah. The prayer was as follows: Lord, Lord God, creator of all things, awesome and strong, just and merciful, the only King and benefactor, who alone are gracious, just, almighty, and eternal, Israel's Savior from all evil, who chose our ancestors and sanctified them. Accept the sacrifice on behalf of all your people, Israel, and guard and sanctify your portion. Gather together our scattered people, free those who are slaves among the Gentiles. Look kindly on those who are despised and detested, and let the Gentiles know that you are our God. Punish those who lord it over us and in their arrogance oppress us. Plant your people in your holy place, as Moses said. Then the priests sang hymns. After the sacrifice was consumed, Nehemiah ordered the rest of the liquid to be poured upon large stones. As soon as this was done, a flame blazed up, but its light was lost in the brilliance coming from the altar. When the event became known and the king of the Persians was told that, in the very place where the exiled priest had hidden the fire, a liquid was found with which Nehemiah and his people had burned the sacrifices, the king, after verifying the fact, fenced the place off and declared it sacred. To those whom the king favored, he distributed many benefits he received. Nehemiah and his companions called the liquid Nephthar, meaning purification, but most people named it naphtha. Second book of Maccabees, chapter 2. In the records, it will be found that Jeremiah the prophet ordered the devotees to take some of the fire with them as indicated, and that the prophet, in giving them the law, directed the devotees not to forget the commandments of the Lord or to be led astray in their thoughts when seeing the gold and silver idols and their adornments. With other similar words, he exhorted them that the law should not depart from their hearts. The same document also tells how the prophet, in virtue of an oracle, ordered that the tent and the ark should accompany him, and how he went to the very mountain that Moses climbed to behold God's inheritance. When Jeremiah arrived there, he found a chamber in a cave in which he put the tent, the ark, and the altar of incense. Then he sealed the entrance. Some of those who followed him came up intending to mark the path, but they could not find it. When Jeremiah heard of this, he reproved them. The place is to remain unknown until God gathers his people together again and shows them mercy. Then the Lord will disclose these things, and the glory of the Lord and the cloud will be seen, just as they appeared in the time of Moses and of Solomon, when he prayed that the place might be greatly sanctified. It is also related how Solomon in his wisdom offered a sacrifice for the dedication and the completion of the temple. Just as Moses prayed to the Lord and fire descended from the sky and consumed the sacrifices, so also Solomon prayed and fire came down and consumed the burnt offerings. Moses had said, because it had not been eaten, the purification offering was consumed. Solomon also celebrated the feast in the same way for 8 days. These same things are also told in the records and in Nehemiah's memoirs, as well as how he founded a library and collected the books about the kings and the prophets, the books of David and the royal letters about votive offerings. In like manner, Judas also collected for us all the books that had been scattered because of the war, and we now have them in our possession. If you need them, send messengers to get them for you. As we are about to celebrate the purification, we are writing you should celebrate the feast days. It is God who has saved all his people and has restored to all of them their inheritance, the kingdom, the priesthood, and the sacred rights, as he promised through the law. For we hope in God that he will soon have mercy on us and gather us together from everywhere under the heavens to his holy place, for he has rescued us from great perils and has purified the place. Compiler's Preface. This is the story of Judas Maccabeus and his brothers, of the purification of the great temple, the dedication of the altar, the campaigns against Antiochus Epiphanes and his son Eupator, and of the heavenly manifestations according to the heroes who fought bravely for the Jewish people. Few as they were, they plundered the whole land, put to flight the barbarian hordes, regained possession of the temple renowned throughout the world, and liberated the city. They re-established the laws that were in danger of being abolished, while the Lord favored them with every kindness. All this, detailed by Jason of Cyrene in 5 volumes, we will try to condense into a single book. For in view of the flood of data and the difficulties encountered, given such abundant material by those who wish to plunge into accounts of the history, we have aimed to please those who prefer simply to read, to make it easy for the studious who wish to commit things to memory, and to be helpful to all. For us who have undertaken the labor of making this digest, the task, far from being easy, is one of sweet and sleepless nights. Just so, the preparation of a festival banquet is no light matter for one who seeks to give enjoyment to others. Similarly, to win the gratitude of many, we will gladly endure this labor, leaving the responsibility for exact details to the historian and confining our efforts to presenting only a summary outline. As the architect of a new house must pay attention to the whole structure, while the one who undertakes the decoration and the frescoes has to be concerned only with what is needed for ornamentation, so I think it is with us. To enter into questions and examine them from all sides and to be busy about details is the task of the historian. But one who is making an adaptation should be allowed to aim at brevity of expression and to forego complete treatment of the matter. Here then let us begin our account without adding to what has already been said. It would be silly to lengthen the preface to the history and then cut short the history by itself. To cut short the history itself. Second book of Maccabees, chapter 3. Heliodorus' arrival in Jerusalem. While the holy city lived in perfect peace and the laws were strictly observed because of the piety of the high priest Onias and his hatred of evil, the kings themselves honored the place and glorified the temple with the most magnificent gifts. Thus Seleucus, king of Asia, defrayed from his own revenues all the expenses necessary for the liturgy of sacrifice. But a certain Simon of the priestly clan of Bilga, who had been appointed superintendent of the temple, had a quarrel with the high priest about the administration of the city market. Since he could not prevail against Onias, he went to Apollonius of Tarsus, who at that time was governor of Celesyria and Phoenicia, and reported to him that the treasury in Jerusalem was full of such untold riches that the sum total of the assets was past counting, and that since they could not belong to the account of the sacrifices, it would be possible for them to fall under the authority of the king. When Apollonius had an audience with the king, he informed him about the riches that had been reported to him. The king chose his chief minister Heliodorus and sent him with instructions to seize those riches. So Heliodorus immediately set out on his journey, ostensibly to visit the city of Syria and Phoenicia, but in reality to carry out the king's purpose. When he arrived in Jerusalem and had been graciously received by the king, high priest of the city, he told him about the information which had been given and explained the reason for his presence. And he inquired if these things were really true. The high priest explained that there were deposits for widows and orphans, and some was the property of Hyrcanus, son of Tobias, a man who occupied a very high position. Contrary to the misrepresentations of the Empire Simon, the total amounted only to 400 talents of silver and 200 of gold. It was utterly unthinkable to defraud those who had placed their trust in the sanctity of the place and in the sacred inviolability of a temple venerated all over the world. Heliodorus' plan to rob the temple. But Heliodorus became, because of the orders he had from the king, said that in any case this money must be confiscated for the royal treasury. So on the day he had set, he went in to take an inventory of the funds. There was no little anguish throughout the city. Priests prostrated themselves before the altar in priestly robes and called towards heaven for the one who had given the law about deposits to keep the deposits safe for those who had made them. Whoever saw the appearance of the high priest was pierced to the heart, for the changed complexion of his face revealed his mental anguish. The terror and bodily trembling that had come over the man clearly showed those who saw him the pain that lodged in his heart. People rushed out of their houses and crowded together, making common supplication, because the place was in danger of being profaned. Women girded with sackcloth below their breasts filled the streets. Young women secluded indoors all ran, some to the gates, some to the walls, others peered through the windows, all of them with hands raised toward heaven, making supplication. It was pitiful to see the populace prostrate everywhere and the high priest full of dread and anguish. While they were imploring the Almighty Lord to keep the deposits safe and secure for those who had placed them in trust, Heliodorus went on with his plan. God protects the temple. But just as Heliodorus was arriving at the treasury with his bodyguards, the Lord of Spirits and all authority produced an apparition so great that those who had been bold enough to accompany Heliodorus were panic stricken at God's power and fainted away in terror. There appeared to them a richly caparisoned horse mounted by a fearsome rider. Charging furiously, the horse attacked Heliodorus with its front hoofs. The rider was seen wearing golden armor. Then two other young men, remarkably strong, strikingly handsome, and splendidly attired, appeared before him, standing on each side of him. They flogged him unceasingly, inflicting innumerable blows. Suddenly he fell to the ground, enveloped in great darkness. His men picked him up and laid him on a stretcher. They carried away helpless the man who a moment before had entered their treasury with arms, with a great retinue and his whole bodyguard. They clearly recognized the sovereign power of God. The restoration and testimony of Heliodorus. As Heliodorus lay speechless because of God's action and deprived of any hope of recovery, the people praised the Lord who had marvelously glorified his own place, and the temple, charged so shortly before with fear and commotion, was filled with joy and gladness now that the Almighty Lord had appeared. Quickly some of the companions of Heliodorus begged Onias to call upon the Most High to spare the life of one who was about to breathe his last. The high priest, suspecting that the king might think that Heliodorus had suffered some foul play at the hands of the Jews, offered a sacrifice for the man's recovery. While the high priest was offering the sacrifice of atonement, the same young men, dressed in the same clothing, again appeared and stood before Heliodorus. Be very grateful to the high priest Onias, they told him. It is for his sake that the Lord has spared your life. Since you have been scourged by heaven, proclaim to all God's great power. When they had said this, they disappeared. After Heliodorus had offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made most solemn vows to the one who had spared his life, he bade Onias farewell and returned with his soldiers to the king. Before all, he gave witness to the deeds of the Most High God that he had seen with his own eyes. When the king asked Heliodorus what sort of person would be suitable to be sent to Jerusalem next, he answered, if you have an enemy or one who is plotting against the government, send him there, and you will get him back with a flogging. If indeed he survives at all, for there is certainly some divine power about the place. The one whose dwelling is in heaven watches over that place and protects it and strikes down and destroys those who come to harm it. This was how the matter concerning Heliodorus and the preservation of the treasury turned out. Second book of Maccabees, chapter 4. Simon accuses Onias. Then Simon, mentioned above as the informer about the funds against his own country, slandered Onias as the one who incited Heliodorus and instigated the whole miserable affair. He dared to brand as a schemer against the government the man who was the benefactor of the city, the protector of his compatriots, and a zealous defender of the laws. When Simon's hostility reached to such a pitch that murders were being committed by one of his henchmen, Onias saw that the opposition was serious and that Apollonius, son of Menesthius, the governor of Coelesyria and Phoenicia, were abetting Simon's wickedness. So he had recourse to the king not as an accuser of his compatriots, but as one looking to the general and particular good of all the people. He saw that without royal attention it would be impossible to have a peaceful government, and that Simon would not desist from his folly. Jason as high priest, but Seleucus died, and when Antiochus, surnamed Epiphanes, succeeded him on the throne, Onias's brother Jason obtained the high priesthood by corrupt means. In an interview, he promised the king 360 talents of silver, as well as 80 talents from another source of income. Besides this, he would undertake to pay 150 more if he was given authority to establish a gymnasium and a youth center for it and to enroll Jerusalemites as citizens of Antioch. When Jason received the king's approval and came into office, he immediately initiated his compatriots into the Greek way of life. He set aside the royal concessions granted to the Jews through the mediation of John, father of Apollonius. That Apollonius, who would later go on to an embassy to the Romans to establish friendship and alliance with them. He set aside the lawful practices and introduced customs contrary to the law. With perverse delight, he established a gymnasium at the very foot of the citadel where he induced the noblest young men to wear the Greek hat. The craze for Hellenism and the adoption of foreign customs reached such a pitch through the outrageous wickedness of Jason, the renegade and would be high priest, that the priests no longer cared about the service of the altar, disdaining the temple and neglecting the sacrifices. They hastened at the signal for the games to take part in the unlawful exercises at the arena. What their ancestors had regarded as honors they despised, what the Greeks esteemed as glory they prized highly. For this reason they found themselves in serious trouble. The very people whose manner of life they emulated and whom they desired to imitate in everything became their enemies and oppressors. It is no light matter to flout the laws of God, as subsequent events will show. When the quinquennial games were held at Tyre in the presence of the king, the while Jason sent representatives of the Antiochians of Jerusalem to bring 300 silver drachmas for the sacrifice to Hercules. But the bearers themselves decided that the money should not be spent on a sacrifice, as that was not right, but should be used for some other purpose. So the contribution meant for the sacrifice to Hercules by the sender was in fact applied to the construction of triremes by those who bought it. When Apollonius, son of Menesthius, was sent to Egypt to the coronation of King Philometor, Antiochus learned from him that the king was opposed to his policies. He took measures for his own security, so after going to Jaffa, he proceeded to Jerusalem. There he was received with great pomp by Jason and the people of the city, who escorted him with torchlights and acclamations. Following this, he led his army into Phoenicia. Menelaus as high priest. 3 years later, Jason sent Menelaus, brother of the aforementioned Simon, to deliver the money to the king and complete negotiations on urgent matters. But after his introduction to the king, he flattered him with such an air of authority that he secured the high priesthood for himself, outbidding Jason by 300 talents of silver. He returned with the royal commission, but with nothing that made him worthy of the high priesthood. He had the temper of a cruel tyrant and the rage of a wild beast. So Jason, who had cheated his own brother and now saw himself cheated by another man, was driven out as a fugitive to the country of the Ammonites. But Menelaus, who obtained the office, paid nothing of the money he had promised to the king. In spite of the demand of Sostratus, the commander of the citadel, whose duty it was to collect the taxes. For this reason, both were summoned before the king. Menelaus left his brother Lysimachus as his deputy in the high priesthood, while Sostratus left Crates, commander of the Cypriots. Murder of Onias. While these things were taking place, the people of Tarsus and Malos rose in revolt because their cities had been given as a gift to Antiochus, the king's concubine. So the king hastened off to settle the affair, leaving Andronicus, one of his nobles, as his deputy. Menelaus, for his part, thinking this a good opportunity, stole some gold vessels from the temple and presented them to Andronicus. He had already sold other vessels in Tyre and in the neighboring cities. When Onias had clear evidence, he accused Menelaus publicly after withdrawing to the inviolable sanctuary at Daphne near Antioch. Thereupon Menelaus approached Andronicus privately and urged him to seize Onias. So Andronicus went to Onias, treacherously reassuring him by offering his right hand in oath, and persuaded him, in spite of his suspicions, to leave the sanctuary. Then, with no regard for justice, he immediately put him to death. As a result, not only the Jews, but many people of other nations as well, were indignant and angry over the unjust murder of the man. When the king returned from the region of Cilicia, the Jews of the city, together with the Greeks who detested the crime, went to see him about the murder of Onias. Antiochus was deeply grieved and full of pity. He wept as he recalled the prudence and noble conduct of the deceased. Inflamed with anger, he immediately stripped Andronicus of his purple robe, tore off his garments, and had him led through the whole city to the very place where he had committed the outrage against Onias, and there he put the murderer to death. Thus the Lord rendered him the punishment he deserved. More outrageous, many acts of sacrilege had been committed by Lysimachus in the city, with the connivance of Menelaus. When word spread, the people assembled in protest against Lysimachus because a large number of gold vessels had been stolen. As the crowds, now thoroughly enraged, began to riot, Lysimachus launched an unjustified attack against them, with about 3,000 armed men under the leadership of a certain Oranus, a man as advanced in folly as he was in years. Seeing Lysimachus attack, people picked up stones, pieces of wood, or handfuls of the ashes lying there, and threw them in wild confusion at Lysimachus and his men. As a result, they tried to get some fresh air, and persuaded him to change his mind. Menelaus, who was the cause of all the trouble, the king acquitted of the charges, while he condemned to death those poor men who would have been declared innocent even if they had pleaded their case before Scythians. Thus, those who had persecuted the case on behalf of the city, the people, and the sacred vessels quickly suffered unjust punishment. For this reason, even Tyrians, detesting the crime, provided sumptuously for their burial. But Menelaus, thanks to the greed of those in power, remained in office where he grew in wickedness, scheming greatly against his fellow citizens. The word of the Lord.